Grozoubinski. I hope I've pronounced that
It's
correctly. Dmitry, I call you Dmitry all the time. So we're really pleased. We did have Dmitry last year or so, and we spoke to a kind of a very small group. And, we just kind of felt that so much has happened in the world of trade. And it's helpful for kind of Dmitry to share with us, when he was reflecting and writing his first draft of his best-selling on the Financial Times bestsellers list, when he was writing his book, it was a very different era. I kind of reflect back and think about the time when you were writing would have been around the time of Brexit, and perhaps then we had more trust in our trade negotiators. I think to some extent, we were kind of hopeful that UK negotiators would be doing their best to get a good deal, but of course, there's lots of debate and discussion, and I'm not going to get into that. It's more the general context, right? Because I think now we're in an era where we have deals without impact assessments. We have deals that are just written on the back of a napkin. We've just had different types of deals, different types of processes, and all sorts of questions around the scrutiny and so on. So I think for you, Dmitry, with the general context, thinking back to when you wrote the book, your main motivation indeed for writing the book at that time, and then if you could convey to us at the current time, why should we be concerned about why politicians lie, or rather, what are some of the biggest lies that you think are being told right now by some of the trade policy negotiators across the globe? I think I know what you're going to say, but let me open the floor and hear from you first, and then we'll just have a little bit of a back and forth, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Thank you so much for having me, Jodie, and very much apologize for standing between you all and drinks. I will try to be inebriating in my commentary. I think for me, I was obviously somewhat radicalized by participating on the front lines of the Brexit debate, and that's where the book comes from. And I think the reason that sort of pushed me was because it felt like the first time trade policy or the trade policy debate felt like it had massive stakes. And I don't mean to diminish trade policy before then, but for the most part, and I'm painting with an impossibly broad brush, I appreciate, there has been a direction of travel over the last 70, 80 years. We would reach a certain level of liberalization, then there might be some tumult. We might have we might start to roll back a little bit, but most of the discussion was, where do we go to next? To what extent can we liberalize further? The subsequent WTO rounds, free trade agreements, and so forth, was like, we have a way trade currently works. We have a level of policy flexibility we have given up in order to create certainty and predictability. What's the next step? And at the time, sort of in a pre-Brexit way, there were certainly lies told about trade. And there were certainly sort of on both sides of every one of those debates, there was hyperbole. There were, press releases from trade ministries claiming a free trade agreement was going to absolutely transform national economies. On the flip side, there was the idea that sort of reducing tariffs for someone by 3% was going to destroy the country. That happened around every trade conversation ever. But fundamentally, the stakes were low. There were very few trade policy conversations where if the ultimate decision had gone the other way, there would have been a strong level of disruption. At most, what we were playing for was like lost potential, right? If you think of trade liberalization as creating positive net gains, we're like, okay, if we don't do this, then we might lose out on that potential gain. Brexit was the first time, I think, in my lifetime where it felt like we were playing with live ammo, in the sense that we were talking about erecting or what elements to salvage of barriers to existing trade. And not just existing trade over the course of a year, but decades, supply chains that had run for decades, methods of doing business that have run for decades. For me, that massively raised the stake. As a professional, I mean, 90% of the people in the room are trade professionals, and you're all professionals in something. It is annoying in a generalized way when people in a public sphere say things that are misleading or untrue about your field. Right? It's irritating, it's aggravating, and it can feel like you're rowing uphill. But for me, the kind of Brexit conversation, and specifically the Brexit implementation conversation, was when it went from this is annoying in a like, I would ideally like people understood what I do for a living, to a hold on, people could die here. And that's sort of what pushed me. I mean, the story of me getting to where I am began with a whole bunch of viral tweets, and sort of I describe myself as tweeting my way into every job I've ever had, which is a really grim epitaph to put on your tombstone. But I sort of think back to one of the conversations that sort of got me to here, and it was the former prime minister of my country decided, who you then named to the head of your trade board, something. This is the Right Honourable Tony Abbott, decided to write an article, I believe it was in The Spectator, arguing that the UK should hard Brexit immediately without a trade deal from the European Union, on the basis that Australia doesn't have a free trade agreement with the European Union and the Australian economy is fine. Um, uh, I think unless there is a plan, and let me say, I have infinite faith in the ingenuity of the British public and the British government, but unless there is a plan to tow the island of England off the coast of Shenzhen and discover about 15 trillion in iron ore reserves, I don't think your economy is going to be able to follow the model of the Australian. So for me, that was actively dangerous, because if the UK had made that choice, and this was a very prominent person in a very prominent position, writing in a very influential, at least with the government of the time, publication, making a case for doing something that I legitimately and honestly and without hyperbole believe would have led to deaths. Because when farmers lose their livelihoods, and I've seen this in every context imaginable, there are suicides. So for me, that stops being a like, it is generally annoying when someone is saying things about the TPP that's not true, and God, I wish people understood scheduling better, to like, no, hold on. This is now something that is on the front page of newspapers every day. Voters are using this choice to determine their own conception of who's running the country, and it matters if they are being lied to. So I think that's kind of the journey, and obviously, you know, I wrote, the book came out last year, and it was mostly informed by sort of elements of Trump 1 and Brexit. I didn't anticipate quite how bad it would get, but sort of the concept remains the same.
Mm. Do you think it's also a question of the kind of modeling and our approach to kind of modeling the impacts of trade deals? As I say, we're kind of in an era now where we're getting away with not much modeling at all, and the economists, you know, the kind of profession, you know, people don't believe in modeling and the power of modeling, and we have a bit of a credibility issue, I would say, at the moment. Do you think there's also you know, a point to be made here about the kind of modeling, impact assessments, and, you know, obviously the gentleman that you referred to, he was referring to an impact assessment, one scenario, and, you know, I'd seen wildly different, you know, some of the estimates. But it led me to feel that, gosh, we've actually got a real problem here in terms of our modeling and the way in which we analyze and assess the impacts of trade deals.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think one thing that people should realize is that modeling is not nearly as influential in actual trade negotiations as you would expect it to be, or as it should be. If you look at the way that most countries will develop something like ahead of a free trade agreement, they are determining their list of offensive and defensive interests. They are formulating a negotiating strategy. They're thinking about what to ask for and what to push back on. In most scenarios, economic modeling will play a tertiary role in that at best. And that's not the way I'm recommending it. I'm not endorsing that approach, but functionally, it is a question of squeaky wheels getting kicks. Australia has pursued red meat access in every negotiation ever, not because we have pages and pages of economic modeling telling us that the future of Australian prosperity lies through selling a bit more beef, but because Meat and Livestock Australia is a formidable, very effective, and very connected champion of its industry that is able to keep that at the top of the agenda. And the same is true in most cases. Simon Evanet, who joined us for the session I moderated, tears his hair out over, for example, a lot of the responses to critical raw materials, whereby governments in a lot of cases are ignoring the materials that analysis and data suggests will be the determinants of who gets to run the future in favor of stuff they've read about on the paper, or in favor of what was making the news yesterday. So modeling plays a smaller role. I will say that I think the public has, to some extent, soured on modeling, and I'm not surprised, but I don't think that is necessarily anything the modelers did wrong. Fundamentally, I think what we've just discovered is that GDP, especially macro modeling of GDP impact over decades-long scenarios, convince absolutely no one. It is impossible to de-abstract for the average person what a 4% decreased GDP growth over 10 years means. I work in this field and I have no idea in practice to like, what does that actually mean for my life? And so when you're putting that up against sort of human stories or pervasive sort of philosophical concepts, you are going to lose. And I think that has created, if I'm being completely honest, the fact that every model that is presented to the public is immediately kind of dissected for its political lean and becomes simply fodder for a political machine that generates talking points, has created some negative examples. Without sort of necessarily naming the organization, the UK debate over immigration right now spends 70% of its time talking about a single estimate of costs that is just wildly wrong. And that the think tank that produced it has said is wildly wrong. And so when you have an incentive to kind of produce talking points and figures, and that even at the point where the organization has said, yeah, no, this is just sort of, we forgot to carry the two here, that dominates headlines and national conferences, the incentive becomes not to do robust modeling that fully takes into account every variable, but to do modeling that generates a splashy figure that comes in a glossy report with a catchy headline and that speaks to an ongoing conversation where it can be immediately plugged in to ongoing narratives. And I don't know what the solution to that is. Apart from, I guess, just greater economic literacy and greater understanding of how this stuff works.
Which leads me to my next question, which really is about what are the sorts of recommendations that have come from your publication, and also, you know, just reflecting since you wrote, looking at the current situation now, what are the kind of recommendations perhaps for different groups of stakeholders? You're here in a room of kind of civil society. We've got a bit of a mix. We've got, you know, people from international organizations, academics, international business, and so on. What would be your kind of recommendations for us as we look ahead? And, you know, as civil society, we also have to navigate this challenging geopolitical context, and, you know, people are worried about their job security, economic security, you know, how do we kind of overcome these challenges with the accountability as well?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a silver bullet to offer you. I can sort of offer some general unstructured thoughts on this, but probably nothing that will come as hugely revelatory to the people in this room. I think the sort of response and the places where the pushback against the Trump administration appears to be working within the US especially, but internationally as well, offers some lessons. We can kind of go, okay, well, that's interesting. To what extent can we replicate that? The polling suggests that despite an overwhelming megaphone and the power of the sort of podium, the Trump administration has not been able to successfully convince the American people that, for example, tariffs are paid by foreigners. And I think if we look at how that was pushed back on, we got a really effective 1-2 punch in that experts did their thing. and experts went on TV and kind of pushed back on this notion. There was a great deal of restraint by a lot of experts that I really admire, because a lot of experts, and I'm definitely sort of guilty of this, have this tendency to want to be the smartest person in a room on this kind of stuff. And on a question of like who pays tariffs, to like demonstrate that they understand that theoretically some percentage of tariffs is borne in some cases by the supplier. And it absolutely is. Like that is true. We've seen that in the statistics. How sustained that'll be over the long term, we'll see. But we are certainly seeing for some products, especially those with significant markups, the producer is bearing some percentage of the tariffs. But the question that I think a lot of experts rightly ask themselves is the fundamental question of the public's understanding of this policy, of the choice they are being presented with. Will it be assisted by me mealy-mouthing for 12 minutes about the exceptions to an overwhelmingly broad rule? Or is it useful for me to sort of signal generally that that exception exists and then talk to people and try to give them the information they need to judge what's happening? So I think experts did well in that regard. And experts, I think especially those who went through the crucible of Brexit and went from having Peter Foster never call them to having like lots of Peter Fosters call them, got better at it. But also we had a lot of human stories. TikTok is absolutely chock full of small businesses going, this is what is happening to me. And when you combine expertise with anecdote, that becomes the plural of data. And I think that worked phenomenally well. And we have, and I know ICC is great at this, we have to sort of, it's a mass push. Secondly, I think we've discovered that there are limits to this in terms of, I've always said like it's incredibly difficult to overestimate the power of the US economy, but the Trump administration appears to have done it. There are limits to what you can push a country to do. Bolsonaro's going to jail. Like EU's not changing huge amounts of its regulation. You guys are probably not getting chlorinated chicken, though I keep refreshing Truth Social to see if that's true. Some of these investment commissions there are simply limits to how far you can push any country. And so there are sort of thinking through that and thinking how to respond to that kind of pressure is also, I think, useful. And then finally, I think finance is completely neglected in this conversation. The one time Trump did a really hard U-turn was when the stock market dropped like 2,000 points overnight. There is nothing more humbling than a trade person than talking to people who advise large hedge funds. When this whole thing started, I talked to the guys that I work with who do this kind of thing, and their reaction was like, right, okay, worst case scenario, US EU tariffs at like 30, 40%. I've done the math, drops EU GDP by 0.06 maybe. That translates to like a 7% drop in Euro US. Cool. We'll send an email to our members, what's next? I was like, no, don't you understand? This is like the biggest thing that has ever happened. And they're like, no, it's not. For them, they're like, I'm sorry, we operate in 9-figure increments. We've got clients with trillions in assets under management. For us, a big deal is whether, Powell winked when he talked about not dropping interest rates by 25 basis points next quarter. That's what moves for us. So understanding where the loci of power is in our system and getting the finance guys more in the tent and talking about where they have exposure, where they do see vulnerabilities, is often the sort of force multiplier cheat code, because they're what scares the bond markets have replaced at least one prime minister in this country in the last couple of years, whereas tariffs did not. A fairly tumultuous Brexit implementation only seemed to make the incumbent more popular. And that makes me think that if we're not standing shoulder to shoulder with the big money guys and at least taking their thoughts on board, and this extends obviously to the trade finance folks and so on, then we're really missing, we're missing the biggest guys in our corner, and that's a real issue.
So yes, I'm hearing very strongly from you that it's about kind of communications, the kind of means by which you reach stakeholders, different types of stakeholders, and this kind of structure of power. I mean, we could talk a lot about the kind of political economy in the UK, financialization, all of that. But for me, that message about communication, and I think, you've done a tremendous service really by publishing, and I've seen, your book Across Waterstones. Hopefully it does feature in curriculum for higher education providers as well, because, you've helped to demystify to a huge extent the process of negotiations and tell it like it is in 2020.
All 7 of my readers.
So no, there are far more than that. But communications, messages, and approaches. Have we got any other questions coming from the room? Yes, like Willem and then gentleman at the back. Yes, please.
I haven't read the book yet, but I'll do it. As a fascinating discussion, so the title is about why do politicians lie about trade. Could we also ask the opposite question, is when do they use evidence or when do they ignore evidence? Would be interested to hear your view on that. So in the period that you described, I was as part of the Strategic Trade Advisory Group and with a range of others. And one issue that did come up, of course, we also talked about modeling, and there had been discussion about modeling, and the most interesting one was about New Zealand. I think New Zealand FTA was the expected impact would be between, at least the first version, between minus 0.3 and plus 0.3% of GDP. So there was also a chance that it would be negatively affecting GDP. But the question is about importing. And I've never really understood why the UK, and I still don't understand why the UK doesn't have an import policy, a Director General for imports, whereas it has a Director General for exports. It has something on investment, outward investment now, also some attention to that inward investment. And despite all the evidence that on at least 2 groups that wanted to see much more evidence and more action on importing, which was one was the consumer group, which, and I think so they basically said, well, trade is good for consumers, so we want more imports. And I think Liam Fox, who started it, this group, he saw that. He did always say and consumers, but after that was dropped. It was just exporting. That was the only thing about trade. And the other group was business. I mean, business were basically saying how terrible it became to import more, in particular after Brexit and so on. It was so difficult. And there were lots of policy papers, including by chief economists in the various departments, that basically writing about the benefits from importing, and that in order to export you need to import. And there's so much evidence and pressure groups, and I've never understood why there isn't why they haven't used that evidence on importing. I don't know whether you have anything to say in the light of your book on that. Why do they ignore evidence?
Do you want me to take another one or to jump on that one?
What would you like?
I'm happy to take that one, and then we can sit back.
Let's respond to that. Yeah.
I'll try to do it sort of as briefly as I can, because the answer to the first question is kind of like the book. But I think on the first issue, I think that the most common lies occur when there is a big question on which politicians wish to present something as not being a choice, effectively, or a choice without consequence. So where I think politicians do tend to use evidence is on things that are less politicized, basically. The further something is from the headlines, the more likely when it comes to policy, or the less chance it has of getting into the headlines, I should say, the more likely that if you scratch the surface hard enough, you will find a sort of dedicated team of hardworking, stakeholder-informed professionals doing like data-driven work. The closer we get to something that will make it onto Newsnight, the more likely you are to see that sidelined in favor of the easier road. On imports, this is a frustration that you are not alone in. A lot of people ask this question. I tend to look at it in terms of the incentives are misaligned for government. And here what I'm talking about is the majority of the barriers to imports, if you think about it, what is making imports frustrating tends to be regulatory and implementation, right? Like we have certain measures that are required to test if your widget conforms with all of our rules, has paid the appropriate taxes, comes from the right places. And in order to make it easier to import, we have to eliminate, streamline, reform those. The challenge is that the risk calculation for the people in charge of regulating the incentives are, they get yelled a lot more if something that shouldn't get through gets through, then they get rewarded for a business having a smooth import experience at the border. And that has been true forever. It's, you know, we in Australia, we used to call it the Sydney Morning Herald test of like, what did I do? How would this read on the front page of Sydney Morning Herald? And the fact is like poisonous, you know, toxic apple makes it into Melbourne front page. Apple importer has to wait extra week, get slightly more wrinkled apple from New Zealand, possibly also makes the front page, but it's everyone cheering because we get to stick it to New Zealand. So I think that is the challenge, and any attempt by governments to deal with that has to basically mean that you're positioning your imports are to go into regulatory agencies who get fired and promoted based on how well they hold the wall, and tell them, hey, you've got to hold the wall slightly less rigorously, or you've got to change the way that you are holding this wall in order to help people whose thanks you don't get promoted for. And that's been the challenge, I think, like zooming out. And, you know, you can deal with that with enough political will, but you really do need like a concentrated plan, which, by the way, to go back to what Agnes said at our panel, this is why often you see like national champions, and where the government takes a direct interest, suddenly they're able to get through, they're able to get the imports they need really quickly. They're able to build really quickly because sufficient leadership from a sufficiently high level can short circuit these dynamics, because suddenly what you're getting praised for is how well you facilitated. I don't know if that's helpful to your thinking. I realize it doesn't solve the problem.
To political economy, I think so. We've got some more questions. So, but Sheila, Emily, gentleman there, and Laura. Maybe we take this group, sure. and I think that's 4, and then
you remember them.
Sorry, yes, I will help you remember. 5 questions.
Really, really interesting explanation and analysis of the situation of how people don't listen to evidence, be they politicians or members of the public. And I really like what you were saying about, you know, if we can come up with examples, anecdotes, that's really important. And then also the financial angle. I wanted to ask a slightly different question, which is, sounds just like climate change. There's a lot of evidence there. People aren't listening to it. There's a very strong financial argument. Any thoughts on how we might use some of the lessons from trade to address some of the things on climate? Thanks.
Great. And yes, there were 2 questions, a gentleman here and Sheila. Yes, and then we can do it.
Emily.
Yes, and Emily. Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you. Can I just like pull back a little and ask the question from your book's title, which is essentially you're asking, why do politicians lie about trade? And I get the fact that whatever you mentioned makes sense to me. But at the same time, I'm also thinking from another lens, which is essentially, to what extent does an ordinary person need to care about trade? Because at the end of the day, it is a lot of information that is thrown at them from all different lenses. And I'm not talking about trade alone. I'm talking everything in the world is vying for people's attention, and there is just way too much information. And I'm a trade nerd, and even I get overwhelmed by the amount of information just on trade. So to what extent do you think that a common man should actually give a damn about what's going on in trade, and how do you sort of get across that? Because there are so many things that are equally as important that you sort of have to prioritize. And then when you start doing that, you sort of lose the plot, because then one after the other, it's just, you don't know what it is. It's just a jumble of things. So then what do you prioritize at that point?
Only for 288 pages. Then
Thank you, Emily. Yes.
On the communication point, I really take on board the kind of the importance of the you might call it like the tears from the grassroots. And it's funny because like for so long it was like always the left and the kind of anti-capitalists who were like arguing against globalization and really, you know, the turtles and the shrimps and all that. And now it's kind of the opposite. It's like all the people who are being affected by Trump's tariffs, the small businesses and such. So I think it's interesting how that could cut across political spectrum in a sense. But I guess my question is, how does that correspond with the bigger narratives about trade? Because I think fundamentally it's a lot easier and more appealing to people to think about national closing the borders, national production, and it's a lot harder to sell or make a case for openness and globalization. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts, you know, for those of us who are trying to communicate in this space about what's the story? What's the story on the more analytical level that we'd want to tell?
Fabulous, thank you. Gentleman at the back and then Sheila, yes.
Thanks. Peter Foster from the FT. Dmitry, you did God's work during the Brexit campaign. We all wrote a lot of stories about SMEs being burned up by the UK's exit from the single market. We exposed the dreaded lies of our politicians glossing over the reality of what a reverse trade deal would do. And yet here we are a year on, the man who bought you Brexit, Nigel Farage, leads the most popular party. Do we draw from that the conclusion that actually there is no political penalty from lying? Donald Trump, one thing a US WTO ambassador said to me at the WTO forum last week is, I never say this on the record, but my biggest fear is that it's all going rather well, right? Trump talks about the $30 billion a month. And, you know, the Yale Budget Lab will tell you how many thousands of dollars a year a family will be worse off than they otherwise would have might have been, just like John Springford and his doppelganger models told us how many, right? But the truth is, poor people are disgruntled, and populists like disgruntled poor people because they can exploit them. And as someone who spent nearly 10 years of his life trying to explain, often to the readers of the Daily Telegraph, all the things that you were trying to explain, often with your help, I wonder whether it was a fool's errand, actually, and whether you have any confidence that, you know, politicians lie about trade and they get away with it.
Fabulous, thank you so much. Sheila, please.
Putting the emphasis in your question on different words, in 1976, there was a referendum on membership. And the interesting thing about it was, first, the costs of leaving when we were hardly in would have been a lot less. The benefits were hardly coming through at all. And a lot of them that we were able to cite in 16 weren't there at all because services were in there. And I was trying to think back. I don't remember it being a particularly economic argument. I mean, I was an economist working in an institute at the time, and it was very much an emotional one, as it turned out to be effectively in 2016. And the emotions were internationalism versus Little England. And internationalism, to some extent, won. And it won because all of the really prominent politicians at the time agreed on it. The same argument making on what you should say about trade in the US. And they made it well. And no one was making that sort of argument in 2016. I don't think we should give up on arguing about trade, provided we do it right, because it can work. Against that, you say lie about trade. They lie about taxes too. And we're now seeing the consequences of that. Politicians in the last election promised an increase in government spending and no change in taxes and no change in the deficit. And it's relatively easy, even for a non-economist, to understand that. And it won. It worked. Has the level of debate just gone down too much in politics? Coming back to your trust. And this is one of the arguments which we used to make for why people were less interested in trade liberalization in the WTO. Is it that incomes were too too high, were higher than they were in 1976, higher than they've been in the past. In other words, a lot of people who were prepared to say, yes, maybe there will be costs to Brexit, but I can afford it. And maybe that's true for those people who were saying it. So again, you have, I think it's not just communication, it's what you are communicating. And I really do think that the arguments were made extraordinarily badly in 2016 by people who were competent but also were making the wrong arguments. Is that part of the problem?
Sure.
Great. So yeah, you've got.
I'm going to try to do this, but
If
you
you
may have
can't,
help.
I will help.
So to start with the question on climate change, yes, there are certainly parallels. This goes well beyond my scope. My one reflection on climate change from the past week, we held like Geneva Trade Week, a bunch of events on sustainability. One thing I kept thinking about is where climate change, I think, differs, is that our ability to combat climate change depends on really long-term decisions by the private sector, fundamentally. It's like the investments we're making today in R&D and manufacturing and the way we structure supply chains and manufacturing, what we're investing in will ultimately determine one of the things I talk about in the book is like Indian air conditioning use is projected to go from about 10% of the country to like 65% of the country in the next like 10, 15 years. And if that happens and isn't powered by renewable energy, we can all go home. There's no point, like everybody in America could immediately give up their car and move to a vegan lifestyle where they grow their own food. It wouldn't matter because of the energy impact of 700 million people running air conditioners 23 hours a day. So it's a massive manufacturing investment challenge, which is ultimately driven not by ideology and not by sort of persuasiveness. It is driven by the perception of business about the mood music of where demand and regulation is going to go in the future. So I think the key thing for the climate sort of community to do is to think about is basically go, even if we can't get concrete outcomes, even if we can't get the Trump administration to authorize a wind farm without a court order, how do we work together to collectively send the message that the arc of history or the long arc of regulation bends towards sustainability in the long run? That if you are a smart company, even if you are seeing reversal in some places, the smart money is to think about continuing to make better PVs, better renewables. And so a lot of it is just like, how do you keep making noise in the right places, even if it's not to affect specific outcomes, but more to just create this like, because like CEOs and boards are humans. And, you know, we're all in open plan offices because like 3 CEOs read an article about it in Forbes at the airport. Like they respond to the general vibes as much as the rest of us do. So how do we maintain the vibe of like, listen, like we're not going back to like Peaky Blinders, fog in the air kind of stuff. That's not where future prosperity lies. I think it's a slightly different space to the trade community, I'd say. I don't know, I can't solve climate. I'm sorry, I wish I could. On the question of where should people care about trade, as I write in the book, I don't think they should, to be very, very clear. Like, I think actually caring about trade for its own terms is rightfully like a niche obsession for like 6 of us worldwide. And it's because we like, I don't know, didn't get better hobbies as kids. It's like one too many 4X games or something. I think where it becomes important to normal people is when it becomes part of conversations about the things they do care about. So if we are running a campaign on re-industrializing the Rust Belt, and you are told that the way to do that is by keeping out imports, you as a normal person should be encouraged to understand that debate and understand why that's almost certainly not true, enough to be able to judge that conversation about what you care about. And this is true of national security, of health, of climate change, of anything. So my kind of line of demarcation is when trade policy breaks containment and starts being part of a national conversation about what the direction of the country should be on issues people do care about. And especially when it could potentially be something that for a voter decides how they'll cast a ballot in the future, or for a legislator decides sort of which way the wind is blowing and which way am I going to go to avoid sort of facing challenges at the ballot box in the future. That's kind of my line of demarcation. After people have paid the like £18 for my book, that's a really important line. Emily's question. I'm sorry.
Emily's question. So we're talking about how to cut across the political spectrum, or how the current, yeah. But also how to sell the openness story and globalization. I think it also touches on Sheila's point, how to sell openness, trade openness, I think.
Yeah, so I think there's two bits to this. Openness has always been really hard to sell, disaggregate sort of spread benefits, concentrated pain, always been the case. The whole reason we have the international trading system is a recognition by governments that protectionist arguments were always going to be tempting. The EU didn't want to have a fight with its farmers about price subsidies every year for the rest of human history, and so agreed the agreement on agriculture in order to lock in the cap. The US had its own sort of, a lot of this has been a recognition by governments that these arguments are just always going to be compelling, because they sound like they push hard decisions onto other people. And those are by far the best kind of decisions when all of the pain is external. There is absolutely no magic bullet to this, though perhaps the optimistic scenario, and this kind of goes to Peter's comment as well, is the extent to which it's not working. I have to confess, when all this started, I'll be honest about this, I know all of the theory. I'm a free trader, I've got Geneva and Trade in the name of the platform. I'll be a good soldier and I'll go up there and talk about open markets and competition. When the US started down this path, 10% of me was like, maybe these people are so big. Maybe US consumption is so powerful. Maybe the US is so powerful, it's just gonna work. At least in the short to medium term. In the absolute long term, it's a bad idea to have an economy run by government patronage, locking out competition, raising barriers, and sort of drawing a giant fence around every GM factory and sort of defending it to their death. I rationally get all that. But the small part of me was going are we going to be sitting here in September looking at US investment numbers that are up 40% year on year, huge wave of new construction, which again, I intellectually know that once that construction finishes, there'll be 4 PhDs in robotics working in it and not 50,000 blue collar union workers like it was in the 50s. I know all that, but I was sitting there going are they going to get a whole bunch of concessions? Is everybody just going to roll over because US consumption is so irreplaceable? I was genuinely concerned about that. And I don't think the statistics bear it out. The concessions they have achieved, with all due respect to the investment pledges, are marginal, illusory, and I think quite transient. They have secured no meaningful market access with sort of love and respect to 16,000 tons of beef into this country. And what did they do? Corn, bioethanol, cool. America is saved. They're not rebuilding the Midwest. Japan gave them nothing. Korea gave them nothing. The EU gave them very little so far. So it's not working, and the polls bear that out. Trump is underwater on the economy. Tariffs are historically unpopular. So from the point of view of is this working? And is this going to be persuasive? It's really hard to lie to people about their day-to-day experience. It's really hard to convince people with data about their day-to-day experience. There was a lot of commentary about the vibe session during the Biden administration. This gets me way out over my skis. But there it was there's a question of how people perceive things. And it doesn't, the CBI numbers are great, but it doesn't matter if computers have dropped in prices by 30% if your rent and your groceries feel higher. So this kind of stuff right now in the US, all of the statistics say people are not finding this to be a new dawn. And we know sort of economically and financially, even if you accept the US premise that it is absolutely vital to rebuild manufacturing, we know what the challenges to US manufacturing long-term are. They are structural, they are educational, they are regulatory, there are cross-border challenges, especially around services. It's impossible to build anything. They don't have the skills, all of this. And these are long-term challenges. So we know nothing they're doing is going to fix that in the long term. And there's only so long you can promise people that they are 5 years away from getting paid $180K a year out of high school to work at a factory, or distracting them by telling them, but look how hard we're owning the libs. Like, yes, your grocery stores are higher, but look, our joint cultural enemies are really crying. There are limits to that strategy, and we're seeing that bear out, and that gives me some hope that both on the transactional diplomacy and on the sort of broader economic kind of protectionist stuff, we may see at least some souring. I'm not suggesting we're going to go back to like the 2000s. We're never going to get back to a place, I think, or at least in the next decade, where you can look at your tariff, where you can look at the WTO tariff schedule and go, this is how it is and this is how it will be, and nothing will change that. We're clearly not there anymore. But I do think that the sort of rapid transactionality, the sort of inside dealing, the national champions, all of that kind of stuff is not working out, and hopefully there'll be a souring on that. And that gives me some hope. I don't know if that sort of gives you any hope. I know it doesn't give Alan Beattie any hope, but nothing does. So, and then we had sorry, I think I've sort of touched on, I think, some of your points. Is there anything I've missed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Peter's point was, you know, we've now got the gentleman that led Brexit, the campaign, and, you know, we've got a kind of, the general population is, you know, we've got cost of living crisis, populism, and this guy could be our next PM.
Yeah, but the reason he could be your next PM is that your current PM has an approval rating slightly lower than Ebola. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And the same thing, like, did Donald Trump win because he promised tariffs and populism? I'm sure that was a factor. It was part of his messaging. But fundamentally, you had a deeply unpopular incumbent. You had a population that was incredibly annoyed about inflation, freaking out about the border, and quite upset at the Democratic incumbent who held on way too long and then, in a no primary situation, inaugurated his largely unknown vice president and gave her 130 days to campaign against somebody. So I don't want to dismiss it. And like, yes, kind of, it doesn't feel like there are consequences. I don't know that there ever, I agree we're in the sort of potentially post-accountability era, but I guess fundamentally, again, what gives me hope is that, like, you don't see Farage talking about Brexit anymore. And it's like, if nothing mattered, he'd be out there going, Brexit, we delivered it, and now the economy's 8 times stronger. We've secured $15 trillion in investment. Woo! And instead, he's had to hard pivot back to his home ground of brown people are coming to loiter on your streets. And I think that perhaps gives me a small spark of hope that maybe some things matter, if not all of them do.
Yeah.
Starmer saying blue team is making you poorer by telling you a load of porky pies about the cost of leaving the single market. And you, as you rightly say, Starmer's approval ratings are subterranean, but he hasn't engaged actually in righting any of the wrongs that, you know, that's the flip side. Yeah, but Farage doesn't, nobody wants to talk about Brexit or the cost of leaving the single market, or indeed the advantages, economic advantages, potential of re-engaging with Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into a sort of relitigate every instance of Brexit, but I will say kind of a couple of things on that. The challenge has always been that no major party in the UK certainly opposed implementing Brexit, and to the extent that it opposed the Brexit vote, it was sort of think Jeremy Corbyn was like, the what? Like, yeah, sure, whatever. Like, I just want to nationalize a bus, which I respect. But so to the point where Starmer has, it's difficult for Starmer to make political hay out of like, look what they did to you, when that was effectively the Labour Party position too, kind of. And rejoining the single market would be a 10+ year project. I don't think Europe has a ton of appetite for it. So in terms of actually what happened is Rishi Sunak, to give him a tremendous amount of credit, moved the UK beyond a point where the relationship with Europe was, where every issue was like, how can we bash Europe to score points at home? He turned the heat way down and sort of re-engaged them and said, okay, like, let's talk about what we can do here within the margins of the deal we've got and the framework we've got. And he achieved some things, which actually left Starmer precious little room. There are things you can do on the margins with Europe on the regulatory side. Anything beyond that, you really need to suspend, you need to really suspend significant amounts of UK sovereignty in order to become part of a single market. The EU has limited appetite to engage with that. So as a policy position, the reason he's not saying it is people would rightly go, so are we rejoining the single market? And he'd have to go, yeah, maybe one day. But I'm not doing it. And I think that's what explains it. So I really don't want to kind of spend 3 hours redoing Brexit.
We have drinks after, so you can follow up there. So Patrick and Peter, and then we have to wrap up. I think we've
2 minutes.
I'm happy to take your question and Peter's,
Okay,
and then we wrap. Yeah.
There's two things I wanted to say. One is on the modelling. One of the reasons modelling doesn't catch anyone's imagination in the policy world is because modelers are notoriously unwilling to do sensitivity analysis. And the reason for that is they want to be able to say, here's the number, guys. And so I think that's been a major weakness. And that was one of the reasons we did very little modeling when in the WTO.
Thanks.
The other thing is, I think there's a fundamental weakness in logic for governments that are trying to do something in the WTO. On the one hand, they say this is good for us. On the other hand, we say we need reciprocity. It's a mug's game. Either you need reciprocity in order to make it worthwhile, or you do it because it's worthwhile. There are efficiency arguments. So there is such a thing as comparative advantage. So that I think that's always muddied the water in a terrible way.
Brilliant. And Peter, and then we'll close.
Sure.
Sorry to sort of go on about the Brexit thing like Peter there did. But the question, my question is, I suppose, two simple ones. Would you describe the way Starmer is saying, well, we will have minimum changes, small changes in our relations with the EU, and we can make Brexit work? Would you describe that as a lie? And if, to the extent that it is untrue, do you think, having given that impression, it is ever possible to walk back from something like that?
Sure, thank you, Peter. Let me maybe start with Patrick. Absolutely agree. On the modeling question, absolutely agree. There's also the question, and this isn't the modeler's fault, there's just a lack of firm level data. Because like sure.
Different variables operate result.
True. But I think like part of the challenges is, in terms of influence of modeling, is that it can feel quite stratospheric because you're making, as you say, there's a temptation to do broad sweeping stuff. I always think back to when I was training UK negotiators and talking to them about the importance of engaging with devolved administrations. I was talking to some of them who like a fishing community, I think, off the coast of, I want to say Scotland, where it's like what they were basically saying was like fishing exports, what they were particularly fishing, I think it was shellfish, to the EU are so small that they do not appear in national level statistics. They were also 60% of the employment of the island. And so you get this constantly in trade, right? And so that you need both. But I think one of the challenges is that by definition, it can be really hard to spot those things. And those are the things that can really matter. I also fully agree of this like internal tension, hypocrisy point. That's always been it's in a lot of places in trade where we're like on the US-China thing, we're like, Fundamentally, we believe that free markets, no state champions is the way that you build a successful economy. But also, if we don't stop you doing it right now, your economy will crush us all. And you're like, wait, like both of those things can't be true, but they kind of are. In that there is a short-term kind of long-term narrative arc of history, broad versus concentrated. If you are applying tariffs on my beef exports, that is bad for your entire beef eating population. So it's only the vegetarians and the vegans that are spared. Everybody else is paying incrementally more. Whereas that is a disaggregated thing. Whereas for me, there is like 2,000 farmers that are being acutely hurt. And that's always been the challenge where we're kind of both right. On the one hand, you're probably mathematically hurting yourself more than you're hurting me. And so I should just get rid of the tariffs I was going to reciprocate, I was going to leverage to get you to drop yours. But I can't do that because I've got 2,000 farmers that really need me to have a bullet in my gun for when I try to get you to drop your tariffs. I think that's always been that tension. That's 100% right. To return to the Brexit mines and attempt to dig our way out, the make Brexit work thing, I mean, I don't know if you characterize it as a lie because it just doesn't mean anything. I mean, what does make Brexit work mean? What is your standard? Are you saying make Brexit deliver on the promises made in the 2016 campaign? No, unless he has discovered the Philosopher's Stone and sort of all of the rings of power, probably not going to happen because that's not how anything works. It's not how math works. If you set the bar as like, we can make interventions and agreements with the EU on a regulatory level that will make doing business across that border measurably better for some UK citizens, importers and exporters, in a way that will make a difference to their business, yeah, I think he is right to some extent. And I think he should pursue that because the role of government is to make lives better for individual British citizens. And so that is worthy. So on that question of like, I mean, can he make it work? It depends on your definition of work. I think he's right. The island's not going to sink into the sea. The union is not going to collapse. So to that extent, he can make it work better than it works today. Whether you believe that that will reach a standard where it is working by some objective, independent standard is an independent judgment up to every British voter.
Fabulous. So I think we've covered a tremendous amount of ground. We can talk more about Brexit after, but I'd like to give you a huge, with alcohol, but I'd like to give you a round of applause. 4 minutes, yeah. Thank you so much. You're absolutely welcome. Great. So yes, we have some